And welcome to our last lecture on Baroque art. So we're heading to Northern Europe, back to the area of the Netherlands, of Belgium, in this region, marked by a war. The Spanish have conquered this area for a bit. The Netherlands becomes a republic. Yeah, so we're looking at this region right here. It's Flanders, northern France. And so war marks the first half of the century. And then we have the Bank of Amsterdam is founded in 1609, which causes the Netherlands to emerge as the financial capital of the world, essentially. I mean, in the 17th century, this region had the highest per capita income in Europe. They had the largest fleet of ships. They were the economic power, especially in terms of mercantilism. And so we already talked about how, for the first time in history, we have this emerging middle class, which is so difficult for us to wrap our heads around, especially in America, because the majority of us are the middle class. But before, it was these wealthy nobles, and then the massive rest of the population were lower class and really struggling. But now we have people who are moving up in the world, and they even have an upper middle class at this point. And so we'll see their patronage throughout this unit. And there's also more of there's trade and science and art and military and investments in all of these, so they become the most acclaimed in the world. So we're going to see a lot of genre scenes because most of these artists are Protestants working for Protestant patrons, so it's less of an emphasis on the religious themes and more on daily life and house furnishings, paintings, tapestries, porcelain within homes, and they're displaying what they've collected and accumulated with this new wealth. We also see more small-scale paintings compared to when we were looking at Italy, and these were quite large. And so these paintings don't have the same purpose as our Counter-Reformation art that we saw in Spain and Italy. Instead, they're more intimate domestic scenes and just activities of daily life. So Baroque is often an ill-suited term for these works of art because they aren't like our Italian or Spanish Baroque. Now, the French Academy and Italy, other art academies of the world at this point have established a hierarchy of paintings. And so the first, most prized, most valued are history paintings, and that's both in terms of depicting an important historical event as well as biblical events, which are considered history paintings. Portraits are number 2, genre scenes are number 3, landscapes 4, and still lifes come in last on this hierarchy. However, we see a major difference within the Netherlands, within the regions of Flanders and Belgium, where they're going to really celebrate these genre scenes, landscapes, and still lifes. So genre scenes are on the life, still lifes become the specialty of the Dutch school, and also landscapes are really important. They're meant to express this higher meaning. Even Rubens and Rembrandt, who will study painted landscapes and genre scenes. We're not going to really spend any time so much on looking at landscapes, but just note that they're very prized and valuable and appreciated in the Netherlands. They'll often have small figures within them or an emphasis on the landscape and maybe a couple small figures that are acting out some biblical or mythical scene, or have some type of allegorical commentary on a contemporary or historical issue. Here's some such examples. So again, we're seeing this minute just attention to detail, where the tiniest little brush strokes are this emphasis on observation, and minute detail is still seen throughout this century. So some other parts to notice is a new term, impasto, which is this thick layering of brushstrokes of paint. And so if you were to walk up to many of these artworks, you'd be able to visibly see this thick accumulation of paint on these artworks where they're painting over and over. We're also going to see a difference in the brushstrokes, more of this looser, spontaneous brushstrokes, where the brushstrokes are visible. And they often helped create a different texture on the surface of these paintings with different varnishes, again, or thick impasto of paint. Unfortunately, many of the varnishes they painted on top of these artworks caused them to darken more because they would accumulate more dirt, etc. Also, the theme of vanitas. So we saw that, think back to the last unit with our memento mori that we talked about. Similar idea here, where vanitas has themes of death or rotting items, etc., or skull, which sounds dark. Sounds like it's depressing. But really, it's to stress life is short, the folly of human vanity, and to instead appreciate life. Remember that it's short. Remember that the little things don't matter, etc. So it's a good reminder of what does matter, essentially. You're supposed to consider the flip side of it. And so let's begin with one of those. Here's the still life, one of the still lifes in which the Dutch appreciated. This is Rachel Royce, a female painter, fruit and insects. So I'll give you a moment to glance around the painting and see if you can recognize some examples of vanitas. Okay, so we have our attention to detail, this meticulous attention to detail throughout the still life with all these different textures and of the different fruit, etc., and even this moss here. And then you may notice we have this beetle right here, and we have this lizard here with the tongue out, seeming to be ready to snatch this butterfly. We have this snail that moves slowly. We have this basket with eggs, and you may notice the little fly here. So this fly on this peach. So this element of this fly, of grossness, of being attracted to dead, rotting fruit and whatnot, and this lizard that's about to capture this butterfly are elements of vanitas, of reminding us of the brevity of life and the folly of vanity. And so to enjoy life. Here's a close-up. So in these different textures, we can imagine these wet grapes, these moist grapes, versus the leaves that have started to brown and are more crinkly, and the corn, and all these different textures of these different fruits, etc. And vegetables. Sorry, I'm coming out of a cold. Close-up of our bugs, and our lizard, the snail. Pause and reflect and appreciate life. We also have this stick bug back here, hidden. Consider that re-engaging idea of Northern art, of re-engaging the viewer with different details across the painting. So Rachel Royce, she has an interesting background, and one of the reasons why she's drawn to not only these still lifes of fruit, but also these other interesting elements throughout the painting, is her father was actually this professor of botany and anatomy, and he curated this large collection of rare natural history specimens. So she had been studying items like these in detail for much of her life. His status in society helped her to become an apprentice pretty early on and to practice these still lifes, etc. And of course her patrons were these middle-class merchants. Having these still lifes is a major status symbol. In fact, not pictured here, but sidetrack, there's this big tulip mania. She has a couple paintings of tulips. But even today, the Netherlands are the largest exporters of tulips. And at this time period, they were so popular, people were essentially spending fortunes on just having tulips as a symbol of their status, etc. And so part of this rage for still lifes was to show these details and to show your status and access to these materials, etc. And some argue that numerous elements throughout this painting are religious, such as the wheat and grapes. They relate to Christianity in various ways. Okay, so let's talk about Rembrandt. Rembrandt and Rubens, two of our main artists of this region. So Rembrandt, he was this prolific painter, draftsman. He popularized etching in this region, often considered the greatest artist of this time period of Holland's golden age. This painting is often called the Night Watch, and the name is incorrect. It does not take place at night. In fact, the reason why this painting looks so dark, even though it's oil on canvas, it looks dark because of the varnish applied to it, which collected a lot of dirt and darkened over time. So it originally wasn't this dark, and the Night Watch was given later in the 18th century by someone else. This is the company of Captain Franz Baroque, which will go into those details. So this is arguably the peak of his popularity, and this is a massive painting. So unlike some of the other Dutch artworks, which are smaller scale for domestic use, this is quite a large painting. It's seen now in the Rijksmuseum. I've studied it and seen it. It's a neat work of art. But I want to talk about some of the details. So during this time period, or let me back up, most of the world does not have an established police force across the globe. In fact, much of Europe didn't have one until Napoleon took over in the 1800s, and he establishes the first sets of police force. So what we have here are these companies of these civil militiamen, essentially, that they get together and they defend their cities, the night watchmen, and where they would go out and make sure to stop crimes and shenanigans, etc., because that increases at night. And so they're guarding the streets, they're tackling fires, they're generally maintaining order. There's not really a clear, defined purpose or parameters of their jobs, etc., but it's still this sense of pride, and they're adhering to their civic duty of helping their city, etc. And so what we see here is these militiamen, these night watchmen, and they're under the command of Captain Francis van Koninkock. He's centrally placed. Our attention is drawn toward him, especially with his black compared to this gentleman in the white right here. And so he's this other important figure within the Netherlands at this time. But they're all in contemporary dress, and so at this point, the upper middle class starts to establish this black outfit with this white frill across this collar frill as being a sign of status, and it becomes really popular with the upper middle class. And so we see that on a few figures throughout here. It's a busy scene. It's somewhat chaotic. Again, it's darkened tremendously over time, but it was meant to be placed within their main hall in which they would meet and gather. We see some elements how they would be setting up each night, where we have all these muskets, they're preparing them, they're cleaning them, they're loading them. So we're seeing how they're preparing for the night, and especially how they know their weaponry really well. Don't mess with them, that they are well prepared. We see numerous important figures of this time period in different clothing, etc. Again, we don't have like this established police force with particular uniforms, etc. And so many of these gentlemen for this painting are wearing their best. And then our eyes are often drawn toward this female right here. Let me come back to that. I'm out of order of what I originally planned. That's okay though. What we're seeing now is actually a cut down version, which is insane. But during the 18th century, I shouldn't say in the 17th century, more in the 1700s. So on the cusp, where it's cut down. It's a really popular one. We have other artists of painting this one as it's being admired. This dog cowering, these formidable night watchmen. And this female figure here, who is quite bright compared to the other figures around her. This dramatic spotlight is shining on her, which helps us to argue that he was influenced by Caravaggio, who was extremely popular, and that this style of painting of this dramatic spotlight has made its way up to this region. And so this is an odd painting, especially, or an odd figure when you consider it's surrounded by men. She's this young girl, and she has a chicken attached to her belt. And so the chicken, arguably, is an emblem for these musketeers who are holding these muskets. And because their emblem was actually this golden chicken claw. And so some argue this is an allegory for them. New evidence of using technology to look at the planning process of how he created. We can see some of the changes that he made and the emphasis that he gave to certain figures over others and additions that he made. So that's neat to look at with new technology. But I also want to bring in that idea of agency that I talked about before with artworks affecting others. And Rembrandt, this night watch is actually, interestingly enough, one of those key arguments because of how many times it's been attacked. In 1911, this unemployed shoemaker who was upset that he couldn't make shoes at the time slashed at it with a knife. And then in 1975, this unemployed teacher ran at it with a bread knife and made these huge zigzag cuts across it. As you can see, they're quite large. It took about 4 years for them to restore it. And even now, when you walk up close, like when I was up close to it in this area, you can still see the remnants of these flashes. And then in 1990, this escaped psychiatric patient threw acid at it. Luckily, the guards reacted very quickly and threw water on top of the acid. And so the acid had actually only damaged the varnish and not the paint underneath. But still, so people react to this painting. In other words, it has agency upon them. It affects people. And we've seen that time and time again with this idea of iconoclasm, of the destruction of images, which is such a testament to how much power these artworks have and how they affect people. And so there we have Night Watch, company of Captain Franz Baninkoff, our leader, centrally placed. Now here is self-portrait with 2 circles. So this is one of 75 self-portraits. Again, remember during this time period we have, or in this region, we don't have this extremely wealthy nobility or kings and queens or the church that are sponsoring these artworks. What we're looking at is mainly a Protestant area, so they aren't sponsoring religious artworks or commissioning religious artworks in any way. So to advertise for himself, Rembrandt creates many, many self-portraits. This is one of about 75 to advertise his abilities. Arguably struggled for much of his life in terms of gaining commissions. But I want to focus in on this one because of these circles behind him. There's a few with circles, and this is to prove how much of a great artist he is and how skilled he is, because it is so difficult to create a perfect circle by freehand. And so to show off his skill, he's depicting circles within his self-portraits to show off how he's able to create this perfect circle by freehand. So interesting. Our Museum of Fine Arts has a few Rembrandts, so I encourage you to go check those out. I'm pretty sure one has a circle on it, if I'm remembering correctly. So please check those out. And let's look at his looser brushstrokes. We don't have these crisp brushstrokes that we were looking at before. Think back to like the Arnolfini portrait, etc. He's become looser with his brushstrokes and things look softer almost. And I point this out because this helps to influence future movements that we'll come across with the Rococo and arguably Impressionism, etc. And so we see that this shifts start to occur with these looser brushstrokes, and you can really see the hand of the painter. We're very aware that this was painted, that we can imagine him applying these brushstrokes. There's also a lot of thick impasto, layers upon layers of paint here that you can see up close, etc. And so he influences numerous artists in the future. Okay, Peter Paul Rubens, our other big artist of this century, of this period. And so Rubens lived an interesting life. He becomes a diplomat, essentially. He's traveling around Europe. He's on the status of the nobility. He becomes knighted. So he has an interesting life and some interesting patrons. Now here's the other difference. Aside from most of this region, where he's working and his own preferences is a Catholic region. So he has Catholic commissions. So we see, such as this one, these religious-themed paintings. These commissions. In fact, he specializes in these large-scale altarpieces for a period of time. That I had a picture of a person looking at it. Anyway, it's relatively large scale. And so he differs from the general golden age of Dutch art because he has Catholic commissions and throughout Europe. We'll look at the previous Queen of France as a patron, etc. But anyway, so what we're seeing here is a Christian seeing the elevation of the cross, where the cross is being lifted up. And so he had traveled to Rome, and so we clearly see the influence of Michelangelo on his work. Consider this depiction of Christ by Michelangelo versus the bodies throughout Rubens' painting, and where these muscles are extremely exaggerated. I mean, look at this gentleman right here and how he has these ginormous muscles. And that's to emphasize the weight of this real body of Christ as well as the heavy wood upon which he's been nailed to and crucified, and how they're heaving it up to show the strain of this. But he's clearly influenced by Michelangelo, and he's bringing the idea of these muscular bodies and exaggerating them, and even going further with these twisting poses, etc., to show off his skill and his knowledge. I mean, he's incredibly talented. In fact, his work outsold other artists at this time period. Again, he had more connections and was elevated to knighthood, etc. So he had more access, etc. We also have elements of foreshortening throughout here. There's this sense of chaos, of urgency, of grief, etc. And so a way to recognize Rubens is he really emphasizes flesh. These figures are arguably very fleshy. The emphasis is on these chunkier, fleshy beings throughout his paintings. Here's Henry IV receives the portrait of Marie de Medici. So Marie de Medici, from our Medici family, ends up marrying Henry IV, King of France. And so, actually I'm questioning that. Was it Henry? Was it France? Anyway, it's fine. So he becomes, either way, he's being patronized by royalty. And so, time periods. Anyway, sorry, got distracted. And so before many are married, a royal portrait will be sent to them to show who they are. Even think back to like our Habsburgs that we were talking about, and how I talked about how there was a lot of elements of too many cousins marrying uncles and all that stuff, and that they would exaggerate and send pretty much fake portraits to future spouses, upon which many were quite disappointed once the wedding day came and they saw these clear signs of issues from too much inbreeding. But anyway, so back to our Medici. And so she patronizes Peter Paul Rubens. But here again, we see this emphasis on these really fleshy bodies. And we start to see these light colors, these bright golds, these pinks, which helps us to recognize Rubens. These fleshier bodies, these lighter colors, and again, the very soft brush strokes that we were seeing before. Here's the arrival of Marie de Medici at Marseille, so an important port in France, and so she's made it. She's come here to marry. And again, these fleshy, twisting bodies, and these contorted poses, etc., these looser brush strokes, these lighter colors. Okay, so let's talk about Vermeer. So Johannes Vermeer wasn't as appreciated during his lifetime. You read about how he was an innkeeper as his primary income. But of course now we greatly appreciate him, and you can see why. Look at this attention to detail. So here we are in our genre scenes. But of course we're going to incorporate our Northern European elements of symbolism, of allegories, of elements of this painting meaning more than what just meets the eye. So here's an allegory of the art of painting. So there's symbolism throughout this, and we see this painter here. We see his ability to create so many different textures and how skilled he is. And this map in the background. So remember that the Dutch are at the forefront of exploration, and they have the largest fleet. They rule the seas across the globe, and so they're celebrating this extensive age of exploration right here. He also, of course, had landscapes, which are popular. Here's the milkmaid. All these different details and textures. And so we see some similar compositions in his artworks. So what do I mean by that? Consider this scene, the girl with the wine glass versus the milkmaid. Allegory of the art of painting, where our light source is by this window on the far left. Not too many figures, but the light is shining down on numerous figures. So I'll give you a minute to glance around this painting, see if you can figure it out. So the argument is that she's supposed to be, or she's meeting perhaps a person who's interested in her, this gentleman, whereas the man who's supposed to be observing this is starting to fall asleep, so she has this coy little look at we, the viewer. She's breaking the fourth wall, where she's interacting with us and smiling that she's flirting, and this idea of love, etc., is being celebrated. And of course, one of his most famous paintings, Girl with a Pearl Earring, with our very black background, that Baroque element that we saw with Caravaggio, how skilled he is at the different textures, this giant pearl, and as well as her glance at us. It engages the viewer. What is she thinking? Here's the astronomer in this similar stained glass and light reflecting on a viewer. Same cloth. The geographer celebrating how they're mapping the world. In here we have women holding a balance. And so there's this beautiful young woman in a veil and this fur trimmed jacket standing in her home. So she's part of this wealthy middle class that has emerged. We can tell that by the fur on her jacket. And then I'll give you a moment to scan this image and notice the details. See if you notice something special about her. Okay, so hopefully you notice that she is pregnant. So that's a key element. And that she's holding these scales, this balance. She has her jewelry box open with these very precious pearls in front of her. There's this window again, light shining down on her, a mirror, and back here we have the Last Judgment. So her pose, the blue robe, are reminiscent of Mary, mother of Jesus. So there's this element of motherhood. She has this precious jewelry on the table, and the scale, and the Last Judgment. So there's an argument to be made that she's considering life and what matters. And this element of Christianity coming through, of course, of this idea of Judgment Day. The mirror helps to make this clear as well with self-reflection. And so essentially, she's reflecting here on what really matters. Is it about these material things that are of value to you, or is it your spiritual, your religious nature? and as well as what life she wants to, she's thinking about her future with what life she wants to practice with her unborn child, or once he or she is born. And so it's this idea of looking to the future, of considering what matters, and balancing that out. And so there's this element of arguably that the scales are the allegory of this last judgment, is that we will be judged one day. And so do what's right and consider what matters. Many art historians argue that he used the camera obscura in helping to create these scenes and compositions. So there's an assigned video about the camera obscura for you. And he may have been influenced by a fellow artist, same time period, 1664, Hooch's interior with a woman weighing a gold coin. Perhaps they were in communication with one another. But I mean, arguably the composition, this idea of these balances, they're quite similar. The table, the rug, etc. Okay, so there's a woman holding a balance. Here's a close-up of that last judgment of the scales. And she has this peaceful look about her. So it's like she's made this decision of what matters and how she'll live her life. Okay, and that wraps up Baroque. Please check out the assigned videos for today.